All right, this is Numbers 9 in the Prager Rational Bible. All right, verse 1. And then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai on the first moon of the second year, following the exodus from the land of Egypt, saying, all right, a little note here. A year has now elapsed since the exodus from Egypt. On the first new moon of the second year. It refers to the second year after the Exodus. And Judaism has two New Years. The best one known and the one celebrated by the Jews for thousands of years is Rosh Hashanah, which celebrates the celebration of the world. And the other begins on the first of Nisan, the month the Israelites were liberated from Egypt, around March or April. And the other celebrates the beginning of the Jews as a people. So these two dates are somewhat analogous to January 1st, which is usually celebrated as New Year's Day, while the age of the United States is dated as of July 4th. So basically, I guess you could say it's the two holidays for the Jews, their Independence Day, and of course their New Year's Day. All right, verse 2. And let the Israelite people offer the Passover sacrifice at its set time. You shall offer it on the 14th day of this month at twilight. At its set time you shall offer it in accordance with all of its rules and rites. And Moses instructed the Israelites to offer the Passover sacrifice, and they offered the Passover sacrifice in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. Just as the Lord commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. All right, the second Passover. Verse 6, but there were some men who were unclean by reason of a corpse and could not offer the Passover sacrifice on that day, appearing that same day before Moses and Aaron. Those men said to them, unclean we are by reason of a corpse. Why must we be debarred from presenting the Lord's offering at the set time with the rest of the Israelites? So the Hebrew word tameh, that's not how you say it, but anyway, because I don't know Hebrew. It's translated here as unclean and elsewhere as impure. But the word itself is not fully translatable into English, and probably not into any other language. One way of using the term is touched by death. And the people who appeared before Moses and Aaron, they did not want to be denied participation in the Passover sacrifice, the religious highlight of the year, simply because they came into contact with the corpse, something that can happen spontaneously and involuntarily. And David L. Stubbs, a professor of ethics and theology at Western Theological Seminary in Michigan, in his commentary on Numbers, he writes this, quote, the importance of these festivals, Passover, Pentecost, or the other name for Pentecost, Savaot, and Tabernacles, or Sukkot, and the ongoing life of Israel is difficult to exaggerate. And Samson Raphael Hirsch remarks, the Jews' calendar is his catechism, and it was chiefly through the festivals and great pilgrim feasts of Israel that most Israelites heard about the determining events of their history and came to understand the central ideas of their faith. End of the quote. And then it looks like it has the two little numbers there to say what sources those come from. And these two sources, that first one Yeah, that first one was from the Jewish Festivals, a guide to their history and observance. And then that one from that Stubbs guy was called Numbers, Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible. Alright. Alright, continue. As much as anything else, it has been the Jewish holy days that have kept the Jewish people alive. And the Jewish writer Ahad Hams oft quoted aphorism says, he said this: more than the Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. And it's also true of other biblical holidays, particularly Passover and Yom Kippur, helping keep the Jewish people alive. And as I note on a number of occasions, nations and religions need rituals to survive, and rituals associated with a nation's or religion's holidays are the most powerful. And then looks like he has some essays where he wrote about this, why we need religious rituals, in his Exodus Rational Bible at Exodus 34:18, and then the power of the ritual at Deuteronomy 16:3. Yeah, you can go check that out in the Deuteronomy 16 video if you want to. Alright, now here's an essay, The Social Importance of Religion. So the complaint of these Israelites is not only, and perhaps not even primarily, about having to miss out on an important religious ritual. It's not about being with the rest of the Israelites. It's about not being with the rest of the Israelites. Religion should be about relationships with people as much as about a relationship with God. People need God. People need people. Our need is to be with people so great that solitary confinement is rightly labeled a form of torture. Our need for people is so great that the widespread modern phenomenon of loneliness is considered a serious health hazard. Indeed, it is rightly labeled an epidemic. And the modern epidemic of loneliness is, in part, related to secularism. No secular institution has replaced religion in providing people with lifelong social interaction. And for all my life, I have had a Shabbat dinner, Friday night dinner, and a Shabbat afternoon lunch, or Saturday lunch, with friends. And if it were not for Shabbat, then this would not have happened. Yeah, he would not have relationships with different people. And it's extremely rare for people with no religion to share meals with people every week of their lives. And those meals, in addition to attending synagogue each Shabbat, I have been the source of immeasurable joy in my life. And this is why the people's lament in this verse is perhaps more than anything else, it's about missing out on being with the rest of the Israelites. If what most troubled them was missing the Passover sacrifice, they could have said, "Unclean though we are by reason of a corpse, why must we be debarred from presenting the Lord's offering at its set time?" And that would have made perfect sense. But they added, with the rest of the Israelites. And it's often said by critics of religious people that church or synagogue has been more of a social experience than a religious experience. While one would hope that church or synagogue would be both a religious and social experience, if religion did nothing more than bring people together every week and not at work, but at a religious venue religion would serve a great purpose. There is yet another social benefit to religious life, and I often remarked that my synagogue is the one place in life in which socioeconomic distinctions are unimportant. And my synagogue has wealthy people and relatively poor people, people who have attained a major professional success and people who have attained minimal professional success. But in synagogue on Shabbat, these distinctions don't matter. And I cannot speak for all synagogues and churches, but I suspect that this is true of many of them. And I cannot think of another meeting place in life in which that is the case. Yeah, but ultimately the gospel of Christ is what brings all people together. It brings down the different walls of hostility like it did with Jews and Gentiles. And everybody is one in Christ, and all of these distinctions no longer divide. Anyway. So, do people need direct communication from God to do the right thing? Well, the direct communication from God ultimately is the Scripture. But I guess maybe asking, maybe for this time. Moses said to them, "Stand by and let me hear the instructions the Lord gives about you." So this was one of several times Moses was confronted with a moral or ritual problem for which he had no prepared answer. And one of the other examples includes the question of women and inheritance, which comes up in Numbers 27, and what to do when one blasphemes God, Leviticus 24:10 through 14, and what to do with an Israelite who publicly violates the Sabbath, Shabbat, or Sabbath. That's coming up in Numbers 15. Now, in this instance, Moses did not know how to respond to a request made by people who were, tameh, unclean, but who fervently wished to join the community and bring the Passover sacrifice. He therefore appealed to God for a response. And none of us mortals is in Moses' position to know we will receive a direct response from God. And this is precisely why we have the Torah, the rest of the Bible, which for him would just be the Old Testament, and the teachings of wise teachers who preceded us. They usually suffice to provide responses to moral questions. And for most people, most of the time, the issue in life is not that they do not know the moral thing to do, it's that they choose not to do it. And in the New Testament, in James 4, it says, if you know what to do and you don't do it, it is sin. And ultimately, the Bible is there for life and godliness. It is enough. And it is good to get advice from wise leaders. There's a safety and a plurality of counselors, multitude of counselors or whatever. But it should never supersede the Scriptures, ultimately for life and godliness. All right, now another essay. Well, some verses first, and then another essay. Oh, this one's going to be longer. Wow. All right, compassion versus standards, verse 9. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people, saying, when any of you or of your posterity who are defiled by a corpse or on a long journey would offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, they shall offer it in the 2nd month on the 14th day of the month at twilight. And they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and they shall not leave any of it until morning. They shall not break a bone of it, and they shall offer it in strict accord with the law of the Passover sacrifice." So God added the situation of the Israelite who was on a long journey. Both the tameh, unclean individual, and the traveler were separated from the community. And the lament of the Israelites who were impure and therefore prohibited from offering the Passover sacrifice raises the important issue of the tension between compassion and standards. From the perspective of the standards of time, these people cannot be allowed to offer sacrifice. From the perspective of compassion, and given that these people had become impure through no fault of their own, they should not have been excluded from the ritual. Well, which should prevail, compassion or standards? And we live during a time in which compassion is frequently regarded as more important than standards. For example, at this time, compassion has led some people to advocate that no students be given a failing grade, specifically black students. But of course, you're not supposed to say that, but anyway. But if widely adopted, this would inevitably destroy academic standards. And in the long run, however, assuming, of course, that there are moral standards. Now, in the long run, however, standards, assuming, of course, they are moral, actually protect compassion. Yeah, if they're righteous standards, yes. And to cite one example in ancient post-biblical Jewish life, one criteria for being a judge on the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, who handed Jesus over to be crucified, by pressuring Pilate, but anyway, was being or having been married or having at least one child. And this would not be compassionate to a morally upright, brilliant, scholarly, and otherwise highly qualified individual who was for whatever reason childless. Okay, so at one point you had to be married and have one child to be on the Jewish council. Okay. But the ancient rabbis believed that having a family was likely to render a judge wiser, humbler, and more compassionate. And whenever society establishes standards, some individuals will suffer. Regardless of what ones they may be, whether they're righteous or unrighteous. And there are age, weight, height, strength requirements to be a firefighter, a police officer, or even a member of the armed forces. And these standards exclude any number of dedicated individuals who cannot meet one or more of them. Regarding such individuals, these standards are not compassionate. If you focus just on those individuals that are excluded. But if you need to be rescued from a burning building, you'll be very grateful that the fire department did not show compassion by lowering strength standards. If in choosing firefighters, the fire department had opted for compassion over standards, you might not have been rescued. And that would not be compassionate to you. So in this case, how does God deal with the compassion standards tension? So God's answer was to retain standards and show compassion. If God had followed only the dictates of compassion, he would have rescinded the ban on individuals with a corpse impurity for this one special occasion of Passover. But if God had followed only the dictates of standards, he would have prohibited the corpse impure from bringing the Passover sacrifice at any time after the Passover. But instead, God maintained the standard. People who were tamei, unclean, they could not bring the Passover sacrifice. But yet he showed compassion by allowing, indeed obligating, these individuals, as well as those who have been traveling during Passover, to bring a Passover sacrifice a month later, even though it was no longer Passover. So, in making social policies, that is, policies that affect others or the general society, it's almost never a good idea to follow the dictates of compassion alone. And the aforementioned case of retaining standards for who can become a firefighter is a good example. And, however, it is often not a good idea to allow compassion alone to determine how one should act, even in individual instances, and not just instances that affect society at large. And people who allow compassion alone to determine how they raise their children will likely raise spoiled children. People who treat their addicted child with compassion alone might well end up enabling and therefore hurting their child. And one recovering addict in his late 20s, whom I interviewed, said to me, "You know, my father saved my life." "How did he do that?" I asked. "He said to me, 'Get the bleep out of my house and don't come back until you're sober.'" Out of compassion for their addicted child, not many parents would have said what this father said. Now, to be fair, there are undoubtedly times where such tough love may do no good, and may even do harm. But as a rule, people who, out of compassion, become enablers of self-destructive behavior do more harm than good. And this is the second aspect to the tension between compassion and standards. Many modern societies drop standards in fundamental areas of life in the name of compassion, or I guess today, tolerance. For example, throughout Western history, societies have advocated a family standard, the nuclear family, a family consisting of a married man and woman and their children, as the foundational unit of society. But in the name of compassion for single mothers and same-sex couples, for example, that ideal and standard has been abandoned and even attacked. And one result has been the ever-increasing numbers of children raised in one-parent homes, usually meaning without a father, especially in the black community, but you're not supposed to say that. And that has been a major, if not the major, source of antisocial behavior. Yep. Why you have so much crime, sadly, in black communities. Well, it may not just be only, but sadly this is a big reason. But that's racist. No, it's not. And there's an essay on this. Why is God depicted in male terms? Genesis 1:1. In keeping with the Torah principle of maintaining both standards and compassion, one should adopt this rule. Standards is the macro and compassion is the micro. We should not abandon societal standards and ideals because of compassion. And we should not abandon compassion for individuals who, for whatever reason, do not live by them, providing those individuals do not deny the societal ideal. Single people should not deny the ideal of marriage. Single parents should not deny the ideal of a family, of a child having two parents. Same-sex couples should not deny the mother-father ideal. Yeah, but they need to turn from that relationship. And there's a third reason to be learned from God's response to Moses about how to respond to those who could not offer the Passover sacrifice. They were not to be treated as victims. Through no fault of their own, they were not able to bring the Passover sacrifice, but once God established the second Passover, these people were just as obligated to bring the Passover sacrifice as everyone else. And the important lesson here is that even victims of misfortune have obligations. And this too is often denied. Many people do not believe that victims, perceived or actual, must live by the same moral standards as others. A common example is how those who believe that poverty causes crime often regard poor people and ethnic minorities who commit violent crimes. They believe these criminals are more to be pitied than condemned. And Judaism is so insistent on the universality of moral standards and obligations that the Talmud, which is the second biggest Jewish text, ruled that even those who have to accept charity are obligated to give a portion of their money they receive to those even less fortunate. And I guess this is a quote from the Talmud. Even if a poor person who himself survives on charity should give charity. One effect of this law was that even poor people did not see themselves as victims and as helpless. All right. And now there's another essay. Nations and religions need rituals to survive. Verse 13. But if a man who is clean and not on a journey refrains from offering the Passover sacrifice, that person shall be cut off from his kin, for he did not present the Lord's offering at its set time. That man shall bear his guilt. So the question posed to God concerned individuals who wanted to offer the Passover sacrifice, but through no fault of their own, were unable to do so. And then God addressed a question that Moses did not propose. What to do with an Israelite who did not bring the Passover sacrifice simply because he didn't want to. To avoid having to bring the Passover sacrifice, this Israelite, in order to avoid being blamed and perhaps punished, might falsely claim that he had been in contact with the corpse or had taken an unnecessary trip. And this Israelite would be threatened with a serious punishment, being cut off from his nation. And the word translated here as kin, or am, A-M, means nation or people. So the Torah, in God's name, asserts that those who deliberately refrain from observing the fundamental religious rituals have cut themselves off from their nation. And since I discussed possible meanings of karat in the commentary to Exodus 12:15, I will briefly note here the three meanings that are widely offered for this term. 1. Premature death at the hand of God, not human beings. 2. No portion in the afterlife. Or 3. Both fates. As no one knows for sure, my view is that it means precisely what it says. The person who is punished with karet is cut off from his people because he has in fact cut himself off. And as I wrote in Exodus, Jews who raise children without Passover and without ritual circumcision, both of which are punished with karat, tend not to have progeny who remain identifying Jews. They or their children eventually assimilate into a larger population and disappear as Jews. So it's important to note that the Passover is the only festival and the only holy day other than the Sabbath for which karat is threatened. And that means the Sabbath and Passover are uniquely important in sustaining the Jewish faith and the Jewish people. And the reason I believe is the Sabbath and the Passover represent the two pillars of the Jewish belief, the creation and the Exodus. And the purpose of karat, in my view, is to signify religious practices, the Torah holds particularly significant. When, if dropped, mean the end of that individual's perception in Jewish life, and most likely that of his progeny. And in the modern, largely secular age, many people believe religious rituals are unnecessary, and they believe that they can perpetuate their religious values without being actually religious. That is, without engaging in religious traditions. Or maybe that whole phrase, spiritual but not religious. Yeah, not being bound to a particular set of standards. Or maybe having the form of godliness but denying its power. And for example, people from a Christian background argue that going to church each week or joining a Bible study group is unnecessary. And they maintain that though they are not religiously active, they're not only good people but good Christians because they believe they are living Christian values without practicing Christianity. All of this religious observance, they assert, doesn't really matter to them or even to God. Well, even though James says what true religion is, to visit the widow and the orphans, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And of course, God wants you to grow in the grace and the knowledge of Christ, ultimately by reading His Word. And He doesn't want you to forsake gathering with other believers to worship Him. So if you think that you don't really need to do those things, then you may need to really examine yourself to see if you're in the faith. Because if you really are a Christian, you're going to have a heart for those things that the Lord would want you to do. And likewise, many Jews say that they could perpetuate Jewish values without even performing any of the religious rituals of Judaism. But the problem is, over the course of a generation or two, dropping a religion's rituals usually leads to dropping identification with that religion, which almost always means one's children or grandchildren will no longer hold many of the religion's core values. And people do not sustain a religion's values without active engagement in and in regular study of that religion. And in general, recognizing all generalizations allow for exceptions, committed and active Jews and Christians do not always have the same values as Jews and Christians do that are not religiously active. Yeah. I mean, there's people who would call themselves Christians I wouldn't agree with. And in the West, when people leave Judaism or Christianity, they or their progeny frequently replace the God and Bible-based beliefs they abandoned with secular religions whose values have little in common with normative Bible-based values. Yeah. Or you may, as I said, you may end up having a form of godliness, but you ultimately deny its power. Yeah, you may end up having like a fake Jesus or a fake God. You might call it Christian, but it's not. Kind of like Word of Faith or NAR or Progressive Christianity or Roman Catholicism and so on. Yeah, those are perversions of biblical Christianity because they end up having a false Jesus and a false gospel. Yeah, and you got many wolves in sheep's clothing, and yeah, that perpetuate those false gospels in the name of Christianity. And sadly, if you want to give up biblical Christianity, then sadly you may turn to probably more of the progressive side, or eventually just become atheist or agnostic or whatever. I mean, sadly, it's happened time and time again in Christendom. So, all right. Yep. And there's commentaries concerning false gods at Exodus 20, verse 3, and also Deuteronomy 5, 7. Yeah, whenever Prager does his commentary on the Ten Commandments in those passages. But too long, so I'm not going to go there. To provide a non-religious analogy, one cannot sustain a loving marriage without engaging in love rituals such as hugging, complimenting, and saying words of affection and so forth. And also, you can't sustain a loving marriage by not having sex. Sex was created for marriage. It's an important part. Yeah, only for marriage, though. And few people would argue that as long as one feels love in his or her heart, such gestures are unimportant. To use the terminology of the Torah, one who does not engage in such rituals will, over time, be cut off from his or her spouse and quite possibly from marriage itself. And rituals keep nations and religions and marriages alive. Beginning in the second half of the 20th century, Americans began dropping national rituals. The birthdays of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, for example, were widely celebrated until they were replaced by a combined holiday called President's Day. But almost immediately, that holiday was understood as, honoring neither Washington nor Lincoln, but every American president. Even though I think usually, if you had a rank of presidents, probably Washington and Lincoln would be at the top of the list. Well, maybe now Donald Trump will get close up there at some point, but I don't know. Yep. And shortly thereafter, it came to mean nothing more than a day of ritual sales and a day off of work. And when Lincoln's birthday was celebrated, it was celebrated on February 12th, no matter what day of the week that day fell. And the same held true for Washington's birthday on February 22nd. President's Day, on the other hand, has no specific date. It's celebrated on the third Monday in February, with Monday chosen solely to provide Americans with the 3-day weekend. Similarly, Christmas was increasingly referred to not by its name, but now as holiday. As in companies substituting holiday party for Christmas party. Schools replacing Christmas vacation with holiday vacation, or winter vacation, and happy holidays replacing Merry Christmas. Yeah, which I know Dennis Prager's really not been happy about this. Calls this the war on Christmas. Whenever you have to say these things instead of those other things. Yeah, remember there's a Larry King episode where he brought that up. So it was pretty interesting. And Memorial Day, too, became just another day off instead of a day to honor the memories of those of the armed forces who died for their country. And Columbus Day was also universally dropped. And one final example is the Pledge of Allegiance. American students for most of the previous century began each school day by standing and reciting the pledge. Yeah, and I remember doing that in elementary school. But that too has been widely dropped. And now you could probably actually get in trouble if you put an American flag up in some classrooms. Or even suggest that you have a flag up in the classroom. Sadly, you can get in trouble for that, which is a shame. Yeah, but you can have a BLM one up or a Pied one up. But not that one. And the result of all this dropping of national rituals has been that many Americans, especially young Americans, were just, as the Torah puts it, cut off from the American identity. And then eventually, of course, you end up losing, ultimately, that identity if it continues. So, and then, of course, if you don't Yeah, if you don't want to practice what God says, if you don't want to be a doer of the word ultimately, then yeah, then whatever Christianity you have, supposedly, ultimately, it's going to prove to not be real over time if you don't care about the things of God, and then you'll eventually just turn away. Or I guess you'll be cutting yourself off. Yep, and that's a shame. Alright, verse 14. And when a stranger who resides with you would offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, he must offer it in accordance with the rules and rites of the Passover sacrifice. There shall be one law for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country. So the stranger, a non-Israelite, living among the Israelites and not simply passing through the land of Israel, who wishes to identify with the Jewish people, and therefore offers a Passover sacrifice, is bound by the same rules of the sacrifice as any Israelite. And I agree with Ronald Allen, who said this: the inclusion of the alien in covenantal legislation, such as this reminds us of God's determined purpose to reach out through His people to all people. Yeah, and ultimately, with the Passover pointing to Jesus, who through Jesus all the nations would be blessed by the spreading of His gospel. And if you don't want to ultimately believe in the Son, then you end up cutting yourself off from Him. But, of course, sadly, Prager doesn't believe that. But anyway, hopefully he will at some point. But he agrees with Ronald Allen's quote, and that's why he's decided to write the Torah commentary, just to reach out to all sorts of people. And the Torah now resumes the narrative of the Israelites through the desert. Alright, and then the final verses. How God navigated the Israelites through the wilderness. Verse 15. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the pact, and in the evening it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until morning. And it was so, the cloud covered it, appearing as a fire by night. When the cloud lifted from the tent, the Israelites would set out accordingly, and at the spot where the cloud settled, there the Israelites would make camp. And at the command of the Lord, the Israelites broke camp, and at the command of the Lord, they made camp. They remained encamped as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle. And when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites observed the Lord's mandate, and they did not journey on. And at such times as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, but for a few days, they remained encamped at the command of the Lord, and broke camp at the command of the Lord. And at such times as the cloud stayed from evening until morning, they broke camp as soon as the cloud lifted in the morning. Day or night, whenever the cloud lifted, they would break camp. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, however long the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, the Israelites remained encamped and did not set out. Only when it lifted, did they break camp. And one sign from the Lord they made camp, and on one sign from the Lord they made camp, and on a sign of the Lord they broke camp. They observed the Lord's mandate at the Lord's bidding through Moses. Alright, well that's all of chapter 9. But since I referred to some of Exodus 12 in the MacArthur video for chapter 9, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to see what Prager has to say a little bit about some of the rules of the Passover. He didn't really go into some detail there with some of those specific rules about the unleavened bread and all that stuff, and then sacrificing the lamb at twilight. So maybe I'll see what he has to say real quick. Alright, I may just read some of these notes here that look pretty good. I'm probably not going to read the verses. But in verses 3 through 13 of Exodus 12, God just outlines the laws of the Paschal sacrifice. And that word is from the word Pesach, which is actually the Hebrew word for Passover. But this was offered on the eve of the Exodus. And the purpose of the sacrifice, like the purpose of the plagues, was to teach the Israelites and the Egyptians about God. And the lamb was one of many animals worshipped as gods by the Egyptians. And the Israelites are therefore instructed to slaughter a god of their oppressors as a way of serving their own God. Which is exactly what Moses warned Pharaoh, which is exactly what Moses warned Pharaoh would do, so to infuriate him and the Egyptians. And also, if the household was too small to consume an entire lamb after, of course, it was sacrificed, and the blood was put on the doorpost or whatever, it would join other small houses. It would join other small households to sacrifice the lamb together in order to not waste it. And all animals sacrificed to God had to be perfect. People were not allowed to sacrifice their least desirable animals. That would not be a sacrifice. And then the purpose of putting the blood on the doorposts was to let the world know that the Israelites reject Egyptian ideas of the holy to such an extent that they would even sacrifice an Egyptian god. And that comes from a Jewish philosopher, Maimonides. And also, of course, the lamb would be slaughtered at twilight, which basically literally means between evenings, as the period between the onset and the completion of the sunset. That would be what we would refer to as dusk. And also maybe roasting the flesh on the same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And maybe roasting would have been the best way of removing all the blood, which you weren't allowed to eat the blood of the animal. Especially with the lamb, you would use that blood to put it over the doorpost. And don't eat any of it raw. And God may be teaching the Israelites that they must be different from animals who kill other animals and immediately just eat the meat. So elevating human conduct over that above the animals is one of the primary aims of Torah law, and it should be the aim of every civilization. And then, of course, you're not to leave anything left over until morning. And if there's anything left over, burn it. And this is how you shall eat it: with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, staff in hand, you shall eat it hurriedly. So God is just instructing the Israelites to be ready to leave because the Egyptians are about to throw them out of Egypt. And then maybe a few other things here. I'm not reading all that. It's just an essay. And then, of course, you're going to celebrate the Passover 7 days. And then, of course, 7 is the number for the days of creation. So the 7 days of Passover can be understood as a replica of the 7 days of creation, because the Exodus from Egypt signifies the start of a new world for the Jews and therefore for humanity, given the influence the Jews and their Bible, of course, Old Testament, had on history. Well, what about this eating unleavened bread? Yep, and removing leaven from your houses. So why can't you just eat leavened bread? Why unleavened? What's the deal? Well, leavening, which is a process believed to have been invented in Egypt about 500 years before the Exodus, that involves the fermentation of dough. Fermentation is a form of decomposition, and therefore it represents decay and death. And Egypt was known for its obsession with death. And the greatest symbols of ancient Egypt were pyramids, which are tombs. And the Torah, in contrast, is rooted in the affirmation of life. Okay. And then I think even also elsewhere, especially in the New Testament, even leaven is equated with sin, which sin ultimately leads to death. The wages of sin is death. And then, of course, Jesus tells his disciples to beware of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. Yeah, and Sadducees. Basically, they're evil, false teachings or false doctrines. And their hypocrisy. And then, of course, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. In 1 Corinthians 5, basically, you don't deal with sin in the church. It's going to end up wrecking the church. Yeah. So the avoidance of leaven, maybe at first here, may have been seen as just a symbolic rejection of the Egyptian preoccupation with death. And then I guess ultimately sin. So much of the Torah law and teaching is a rejection of the values of Egypt, most particularly the emphasis on death and the worship of nature. But if you did eat leavened bread, you would be cut off. And a little bit earlier, Prager talked about the word karet. Well, this is where he got it from. What does karet or cut off mean? And he gives the three different things that it could mean. It could refer to premature death, or it could refer to the eventual ending of the sinner's family line, or it could refer to being cut off from life in the world to come. But that punishment for eating leaven on Passover, it shows how important the Torah considers from refraining from eating leaven on Passover. And I guess ultimately shows how important it is to turn from sin. Because ultimately, sin will cut you off eternally. Maybe that could be another point as well. So instead, you need to eat on the flesh of Christ, who is without sin, or I guess unleavened. Yep, believe in him and you will be not cut off from God because of sin. Your sin will be dealt with. Yeah, maybe that could be a reason for unleavened. Yeah, it's amazing. These connections are there. All right, and then I'm trying to see what else he got here that may be pretty interesting. And of course, you got the plagues. And also, of course, with the eating of the unleavened bread, it is a reenactment of the time during the Exodus in which the Israelites fled in haste. Yeah, and also probably if you ended up having leavened bread, it would take time for it to be so. But of course, they would be leaving pretty soon after the plague, so there's no time. So maybe that could be another reason. All right. And then, of course, If a non-Israelite wanted to join with the people and eat the Passover sacrifice, they had to be circumcised. And there's plenty more, but I just wanted to look a little at some of that in Exodus 12, just to get some more perspective about the Passover. All right, well, that's all. Lord willing, I'll get to chapter 10 next time, but until then, may God bless you, and the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.